Cheating husband demanded to choose between keeping the baby or marriage, made an abortion but he is filing a divorce. My wife and I met in 2008 when we were both traveling. We met in Madrid and it was a very stereotypical meet cute. Our eyes met from across the bar and I approached her. We ended up going home together that night. We spent the next 3 days having sex and drinking and soaking up the sun, and decided to keep in touch. She went home and I finished my travels and we began a year-long LDR before I moved to be with her. Over the course of the LDR she divulged to me that she had cheated on a previous boyfriend and felt bad about it, but felt his choice to dump her was over the top and that cheating wasn't always a silver bullet, especially since it was only a kiss. I realize now that she was sizing up my reaction and almost certainly cheating. This I can actually forgive and let go because fuck LDRs and it's in the distant past, but not what happened last week. I told her at the time it was a deal breaker, and if I caught her so much as flirting with another man I would dump her. There are two absolute no-nos in a relationship: no violence and no cheating. A year after I moved we got married, and a year later again she fell pregnant. I was overjoyed. She seemed distant and sad and anxious the first 2 months after finding out, and eventually, after I poked and prodded, she broke down and told me she had a one-night stand around the time of conception and the kid might not be mine. I was on a plane back home 2 days later and didn't speak to her for a month. I ignored all her messages and calls, but eventually I caved and we talked. She said she was going to get an in utero paternity test and if the baby wasn't mine she would abort, but that she wanted me to come back first. I went back and she got the test. I was in the room when she got the results. Not mine. I told her she was scheduling the appointment that day or I was going to a divorce law, as soon as I left the hospital. She scheduled the appointment for a week later. The day of the appointment I drove her and held her hand, as an abortion, under any circumstances, is a traumatic event for a woman. In the car she broke down in tears and begged me to wait, change my mind, try to make it work, anything but go through with it, and I looked her dead in the eye and told her do whatever you want, it's your body and your life, but I will not raise another man's child. That child will be the living embodiment of your betrayal and a daily reminder of what you did. I will not subject myself to that. Abortion or divorce. Edit for detail. I wanted a divorce. As soon as she hesitated I jumped right to divorce. I never tired to talk her into it. I advised against the abortion. She didn't want to keep the kid and lose the marriage, she wanted both. She told me directly that she would abort if I left her regardless. She even told me before I flew back that even if the baby was mine and I divorced her she would be getting an abortion. She wanted specifically to keep the child and have me raise it with her, and unless I stayed she was getting the abortion no matter what. That was not happening. She asked me if she had it if I would give her another chance. I said yes. I loved my wife. Fucking sue me. I am not sorry I refused to play daddy to her infidelity spawn. She got the abortion. There were complications and she was on bed rest for a month. For a while after she was short with me. Unaffectionate and cold. We lost the spark. I tried, she didn't. She told me one night after a few drinks that she resented me for making her choose. I told her I was glad she got the abortion as she deserved to suffer for what she'd done. I regretted saying this out loud immediately, even though that is exactly how I felt and still feel. One day I came home early from work and found her crying on the couch with a man next to her holding her. A man I'd met many times before. A man she worked with. The look on their faces told me everything I needed to know. He was the father. It wasn't a one-night stand. After I dragged him out of the house by his neck she admitted they'd had a 3-month affair. I will never know if this is the extent of the truth. To this day I accept that and have stopped asking. I began divorce proceedings and immediately kicked her out of the house. She begged and cried and pleaded for months, and again, stupidly, I broke and took her back. I told her she had to quit her job and cut contact. She agreed and made the call there and then. We moved away from her city and bought a house in mine in the other end of the country. We went to marriage counseling and got better. Slowly but surely we went from strength to strength. We now both had total transparency on all accounts and accepted that's the way it was. As time went on I stopped looking on her phone. Things were great between us. Our sex life was great, we're both travel junkies and went on lots of trips, and started talking about having kids. We tried for 2 years to conceive a child and it hadn't happened yet, but the practice was a lot of fun, so what the hell. This was the case for years. I was completely unguarded and my defenses were down when the most recent event happened. She had gotten slightly distant for a couple of months, but not so much that I was worried. I asked her about it and she always made a point of being affectionate when I did and assuring me it was all good, but her default, when not being prompted, was to be quiet and seek out her own space. She was out drinking with her friends one night and I stayed at home. I woke up at 4 a.m. and heard her voice downstairs. I went out and asked if that was her, no answer, she didn't hear me. I guessed pretty quickly that she was on the phone, and due to the time it was, her recent withdrawal, and her dubious relationship with loyalty I decided to listen in. She was laughing and flirting and saying shit Lee, hey I miss you too and I love you too. I knew it was him, I was certain of it. Then she started talking about the hotel, how good the room service was and when she could see him again, and I had heard enough. I charged down the stairs like a bull and she knew she had been caught. She started yelling and screaming and cursing me, shouting that she'd been to a doctor here and she'd told her during the abortion there was some sort of a problem. She was drunk and slurring her words and crying, but somewhere in the minutiae of words like tear and scar tissue and permanent, I got it out of her that her uterus had been damaged and it was unlikely she could ever bring a baby to term. She'd found this out 3 months prior, right around when she started getting distant again. I grabbed the phone out of her hand. She tried to take it back. We clawed back and forth until I shoved her back on the couch and told her not to get back up until I told her to. I sat on the chair opposite her and went through every detail. A half-dozen text messages from him asking when she was going to be leaving the bar, and that he missed her voice, and how much fun they'd had. Obviously all the other messages had been deleted, but she hadn't had a chance to delete the ones from that night yet. I read the messages aloud and she stared at me with daggers in her eyes. I asked her over and over to explain herself, and eventually she jumped up and started screaming again. She screamed that she'd taken a day off work and dove to meet him halfway and they fucked in a hotel all day. She screamed that when she got the news from the doctor she saw me as an enemy and he was her ally. She screamed at me that she wasn't sorry and that I'd ruined her life. I yelled back that I was glad she got the abortion and if I could kill him and take that away from her too I would. She slapped me across the face. And I slapped her back. Hard. It was open-handed, but proportionally much harder than she hit me. She fell back onto the couch and looked at me stunned and in disbelief as she held her face and began to sob. She reached for her phone and I snatched it away from her, before throwing it and smashing it against the wall. I went up to my room and paced back and forth, and she sat downstairs crying, and that's where we stayed until morning. When I went downstairs she was asleep. I woke her up and told her to get a shower and get out. That I'd already made an appointment with my lawyer to file for divorce and she wasn't staying in the house while I was gone. She sobbed and begged me not to go through with it. She said she was drunk and didn't mean it. Said she only made up the story about meeting him to hurt me and that I was her one and only and blah blah blah. She said she was sorry she hit me and didn't want an apology for me hitting her back, that she deserved it. I agreed she deserved it and told her it was good she wasn't waiting for an apology because she would be getting one. That was last week. This week she's back living with her parents. She calls me every day. 10 times a day. She sends lengthy, weepy text messages that I don't read or reply to, as my lawyer says I shouldn't contact her unless through him. I'm going forward with a divorce. FML edit, an important note I left out, that I have answered on numerous comments and it wasn't until someone pointed out I should have mentioned it in the op. She stated she had no interest in raising the baby alone. If I divorced her she was going through with it. She didn't want to keep the baby and I made her get rid of it. She wanted us both to keep it and be the father to the child of the man she cheated with. At this point I still believe the pregnancy was due to a one-night stand she had a weekend away with the girls. She was not on a weekend with the girls. Wife's POV, I use Reddit too. If you thought I wouldn't stumble on this post you clearly didn't think it would blow up the way it did. I was 20 when I met my husband. We met when we were both traveling out Europe. I was just finishing my trip, he was just starting his. We met and slept together the same day and spent my last few days together. For anyone saying this was a red flag for him any more than it was for me, your sexism is showing. After he went home we struck up communication again and had a long-distance relations that lasted a year. During this time we talked about previous relationships and why they failed. I told him my ex dumped me for kissing another girl, and at the time I didn't think it was a big deal, but I had since realized that cheating is cheating and it was wrong of me to do it. He moved to me as his work is freelance and he can do it from anywhere and I had spent the last year settling into a job I really liked. This was his suggestion. He makes more money than me and wanted to buy a house right away. I told him I would rather wait until we were married. We had discussed marriage at length and it's what we both wanted, and we could buy one together, but he said he didn't want to throw money away on rent, and when we got married and I signed a prenup he would put my name on the mortgage. The suggestion of a prenup was offensive as he knew my family are well off and I'd never cared about money, but I agreed. I also wanted to keep my own last name if we got married, and he said he wouldn't marry me if I didn't take his last name. This I also agreed to. He said fair is fair and if I wanted to live and raise kids near my family and not his, and I'd be the one to stay home while he worked when we had kids, which I wanted, then I had to make compromises too. I didn't think these were fair compromises, but I agreed. He bought the house against my wishes and then we got married, and to his credit, he put my name on the mortgage the following week. But this all left a bitter taste in my mouth. For the most part things were great. I had a good social life and was outgoing. He was more of a stay-at-home type. I had lots of friends, he was focused on work. We were different, but we made it work. One of the men I worked with expressed an interest, even knowing I was married, and I told him no. I told my husband this and he asked me to stop spending time with him outside work. I told him no as I had already shot the other man down. This was a mistake on my part and I admit it. When things were good they were great, but I also had resentments about the decisions I'd been forced to make and felt less like an equal partner in the marriage by the day. He bought a dog without my consent. When we were long distance I told him I wanted a dog, but that I wanted to wait until we had kids so they could bond together. He claims I never mentioned this last part. He says I didn't, I say I did. He claimed it was a surprise for me and that I was ungrateful for kicking up a fuss, so the dog stayed. I've never been great at communicating and prefer my own space when things go bad, so instead of talking about these issues I let them fester and spent more time with my friends, including the guy from work. My husband was overprotective and asked me to check in with him if I was out late and asked me not to stay out at night, even when I was staying at a female friend's house. I am not the apron and dishwashing type of woman. I have always valued my freedom. These arguments drove a wedge between us and I made a terrible decision. I was drunk and slept with the guy from the office. I came home after and slept on the couch and cried all night. My husband came down the next morning and attacked me for not coming home at a reasonable time, said I was a mess because I slept in the clothes I went out in and that I looked like a hooker. The other man, Greg, never said things like this to me. He enjoyed being social and dancing and all the other things my husband didn't. I was young and stupid and decided to keep seeing him. He was kind and decent, and the more time I spent with him the more I wished I'd met him first. I found out I was pregnant. I didn't know who the baby was and I was racked with guilt. I told Greg the day I found out and he told me to get an abortion, that he didn't want to get caught up in the middle of raising a kid with a married woman. This was the moment when the affair ended. I told my husband a week later. He didn't have to pry the truth out of me like he said in his post. A couple of months in he saw me upset and I told him. He flew home without telling me and ignored my calls. I realized then that I'd made a terrible mistake and decided to recommit to my marriage. I told him I would get an abortion if the child wasn't his. He told me to go fuck myself and hung up. Eventually he came home and we found out the baby wasn't his. So as we agreed, I put on the appointment for the abortion. When we did the paternity test, the doctor asked me if I wanted to know the sex. My husband answered for me and said it doesn't matter, and we left. I went back without him and found out it wasn't an IT, it was a she. My daughter. Over the course of the week I had thoughts of being a mother. I had always wanted to raise kids, and in my fantasies during this week I didn't think about the other man. This was my husband's baby. I pictured the three of us together as a family. It wasn't ideal, but there was no good reason I could think of that we couldn't make the best of a bad situation. I planned to tell him who the father really was. I panicked and told him it was a one-time thing while I was away for the weekend, and I would quit my job. It wasn't perfect, but if he loved me we could make it work. Life throws tests at us, and when I took my marriage vows I realized this and hoped he would too. The day of the appointment I begged him not to make me choose. I begged him to do one thing for me. Not to commit to a lifetime of it. Not even to love the baby. Just to do one thing for me. I begged him to try. I asked him to give it a chance. He told me he was filing for divorce. I need to make something clear. Yes, I made mistakes, but I love my husband. He was the great love of my life and still is. He told me he wouldn't even try to make it work, and if I didn't have the operation he would leave me and file for divorce that day. I asked him to let me think about it, and he said no to that too. I was torn between two horrible choices, and I chose one. I had the abortion. I was never going to raise a baby alone. If he wasn't with me on this, I wasn't going through with it, and he made it clear he wasn't with me. The few weeks after the operation I was in more pain than I had ever been in my life. During this time I stayed with my parents because we couldn't be around each other. I blamed him for making me choose. He still hated me for the cheating, and even told me he hated me for wanting to keep the baby and for asking him to be around for us, but I didn't want it to be in vain, so I moved back home and tried to make it work. I kept my feelings bottled up because I didn't want to remind him of what I'd done. I was on medical leave for 3 months and none of my friends knew. As far as they knew, Sam, my husband, and I had miscarried, as did my parents. I had nobody to talk to. I asked Greg to come over and we talked. I cried and he cried with me. It felt good to be heard and not have to wear a mask. These visits happened another half a dozen times, and it's important to know nothing sexual happened. The affair was over. I was leaning on a friend, the only friend who knew what I was going through. You know the rest. He came home. Found out Greg was the father. We moved away and things got better. These were great years and I loved him with my whole heart. I never forgot what happened, but we talked about having our own children. I was happy, and I had him to thank for that. When I found out I couldn't have children anymore, I tried to tell him, but I remembered the way he looked at me years ago when he found out. The names he called me. I thought of how much he loved me and I didn't want to ruin that by telling him I could never give him children because of my betrayal. I reached out to Greg. I found out he'd moved away from our hometown too and was only a few hours drive away. He is married now, but I wasn't looking to start anything back up. Only to talk. He told me I should tell Sam. I couldn't. We agreed to meet and I took the day off work. We met halfway and we slept together. We agreed it would be a one-time thing and both went back to our partners. To anyone who wants to call me a whore, I know it was wrong, but life isn't black and white. I don't regret anything. I love them both, and for better or worse they will both always be a part of what makes me who I am today. I got drunk and told Sam everything. I was hurt and cruel to him and told him I wasn't sorry I met up with Greg. He called me a whore, again, and told me he was glad I gave up the baby. I slapped him, he slapped me back. I don't resent him at all for hitting me. He had never lifted a hand to me before and I said awful things that night, but after he told me he was glad that the choice he forced me into deprived me of ever being able to be a mother, that I can't forgive. I will never forgive myself for the abortion, and I will never forgive him. The difference is he gets to move on and have a family, and I never will. I'm back home with my parents now and I've spoken to divorce lawyers too. They say a prenup doesn't mean anything anymore, but I'm not going to take anything away from you. I just want it to be over too, so maybe we can both find some peace. Update 1: I talked to a therapist today. I read all your comments last night and this morning, and when I came back. I've been reading all of your messages all day, even if I haven't replied. I've been reading and digesting all of it. Some people have been really kind and told me I'm only human and made mistakes. These comments took place in private message. I mag, E for fear on behalf of the commenter of being mocked. Some people took a harsher line and told me that I was completely to blame and a total fuck up, but that it's not too late and I can always turn it around. And some of you, let's be honest, the sweeping majority of you have been awful horrible hate-filled pricks who have entirely too much invested in an internet stranger's marriage and extramarital affairs. You should all maybe look at your own lives and try to figure out why you feel the need to go online and tell bad people why they're bad people. That being said, every message has helped me. The cruel ones shook me to my core, and had they not been so brutal and so many, I could have maybe shrugged them off, but there are over 1,000 comments on this page and there are probably less than 100 that aren't some variation of calling me a cunt or a whore or a monster, and even when I stopped replying I kept reading. I have read every single word that every single one of you has typed. It shook my foundations and allowed cracks to appear that I've been chipping away at ever since. I read all last night. Slept 4 hours, read again, say my therapist, and read some more. The kind messages were a life ring. I needed those too. But again, if they had been the majority I could have taken the easy road. I needed the breath of air every once in a while, but the poison cleaned me out, and the moderate messages kept me grounded between the extremes. I don't want to detail everything on here that my therapist and I talked about because this is already a rant and I'm not done yet, but 1 hour with a paid professional and 1,000 insults held a pretty inescapable mirror up to my face. Sam did absolutely nothing wrong. I would say I forgive him for the abortion, but there is nothing to forgive. That was the biggest realization I've had. I put him in an awful position and asked him to do something that probably would have driven him to suicide. I chose to have the abortion on and mutilate my own body beyond repair. I alone chose that. I selfishly destroyed my marriage, twice, by cheating, because fucking and forgetting being a grown-up was easier than being an adult and standing by the man I swore to love and expected such staggering loyalty from. I betrayed him in ways I, as a woman, am incapable of ever understanding, and I have to live with that, and my mutilated body forever, and I should live with that forever as a reminder. I want to express my genuine gratitude to each and every one of you, but there are two people I want to thank in particular. The first is the man or woman who PM'd me about the authentic me about what I was truly asking of my husband and what it would have meant for him to push him to accept. I would have enslaved him. I don't remember your name. I'm sorry. There are so many messages. I hope you see this update. Thank you. And the other is you/relationships_shit. Your breakdown of me made the first crack. I don't think you were trying to help me. But you did. I'm grateful to you all and I will keep reading comments or PMS if any of you have anything to say. I'm open to talking to people. I will not be replying to any more hateful messages, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't type them because I will see them, and if you really need to keep telling me what a diseased person I am, then do, because I am. Someone just made a post about a retarded dog and it was the first time I've smiled in 2 days, so I'm not sitting here crying and being a victim. I'm digesting it all. Thanks Emily, since I named everyone else, and if you're reading this you deserve so much better.